Content warning. These witness accounts contain descriptions of violence against animals and may be disturbing to some listeners. I'm not going to use my name here because I can't afford any repercussions for talking about this. A few weeks ago, there was an incident on my shift that I have not been able to shake since. I saw something out on the tracks that scared me in a way I didn't think was possible at my age. I'm putting this down as clearly as I can, because if I don't write it out, it feels like it didn't happen, and it did. I'm a freight rail yard switchman. I've worked railroad jobs most of my adult life, mostly switching and groundwork, lining switches, riding cuts, coupling and uncoupling, walking tracks, doing brake tests, calling signals to the engineer, that kind of work. I'm not new to being outside at night, and I'm not the kind of person who spooks easily. This happened on a night shift in a remote part of Illinois at a rundown siding we use as a meet and hold point. It's not a passenger station, and it's not a nice yard. It's basically old tracks, rubbish, weeds, broken lights, and a small office shack that's been patched up 100 times. There's a road out front, but not much traffic, and on night shift, you can go hours without seeing anyone who isn't railroad. We had a westbound train coming through, headed toward St. Louis. Mixed freight, mostly boxcars and covered hoppers, plus a few other cars in the middle. It wasn't our train. We were just holding it briefly, as there had been a mishap further down the main line. Right before I finished my lunch break, one of the younger guys on the crew, new guy, early 20s, came back into the office fast, like he'd been running. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide. He said there was some kind of monster out between the boxcars. Everybody in the break room started in on him right away. Jokes, calling him names, asking how much he'd had to drink, whether he'd been watching scary stuff on his phone, whether it was just a filthy drifter or a big dog. That's how it goes in railroad work. If you say something stupid, the first reaction is to make fun of you. Good laughs make the job bearable. Part of why we did that is because we've all worked this place for years, some of the guys for decades, and no one's ever seen any monsters out in the yard. The worst we normally deal with is the odd aggressive addict, or a transient riding cars and refusing to leave. Sometimes it's thieves cutting air hoses or trying to break seals. Sometimes it's kids doing stupid stuff near the tracks. You learn to expect people, not monsters. There's never been an animal out there bigger than a stray dog or a coyote, and we don't have bears in that area. I didn't dismiss him, but I didn't believe him either. As I said, we do get people around the tracks. I've run off drifters before. Some of these people look less than human and are anything but reasonable. They can get aggressive, but we still have to deal with them. It's a safety issue because someone can get killed quickly around cars, especially at night. So I figured that's what it was. A person hiding between cars or riding inside an empty boxcar. The young guy kept insisting it wasn't a normal person, but I assumed he was keyed up and seeing things wrong. So I took my flashlight and went out to have a look. My plan was to find whoever it was, get them to move along, and if they wouldn't, call it in. I didn't go out there looking for trouble. I went out there because it's part of the job. I walked along the ballast between two rows of cars, the St. Louis-bound train on my right and a parked cut on my left. My eyes were searching for any sign of movement in the shadows between the two rows. The light situation wasn't good. There were yard lights, but some were out, and the train itself blocked most of what little light there was. Then I saw something shift in the dark, further down the lane. I couldn't make out details at that distance, but it rose up enough that I caught a hint of a shape for half a second. My first thought was that it had to be a person. I took a few steps toward where I'd seen it, and that's when my flashlight caught something on the gravel right in front of me. It was glistening wet in the beam. At first I thought it was just water or oil, because you see all kinds of spills around rail cars, but the color was wrong. I stopped and bent down slightly to get a better look without taking my eyes off the lane. It looked like blood, not a small spot, more like a decent smear and droplets, dragged or tracked across the stones. At that point, I still wasn't particularly concerned. I've seen all sorts of weird stuff out there over the years. People cutting seals, dumping trash, shooting up between cars, fighting, bleeding, you name it. Blood on ballast can mean a lot of things, and most of them are human. That smear had direction to it. It wasn't just a puddle. It trailed forward down the lane toward the same spot where I'd seen that shapeshift. I started walking again, keeping the light low to follow the marks and lifting it every few steps to scan ahead. After walking a few more yards, I could hear something further down the lane, faint shuffling, then a short burst of thrashing, like somebody handling something heavy in a tight space. My first thought was luggage or a duffel bag, maybe someone dragging trash bags or gear they'd stashed. The more I listened, the more convinced I became that it was just a person, someone taking a free ride on the train. I brought the flashlight beam up higher, trying to catch a face. I also started yelling as I walked. I told him to come out. I told him he was on railroad property and he needed to show himself. I said it loud because there's no point whispering out there with the train noise. I expected either a guy to pop up and run, or for someone to start cussing me out from the dark. I saw movement again, clearer this time, something shifting near an open boxcar door ahead. It looked like someone had been using that opening to get in and out of the car. I kept moving toward it, light fixed on the doorway, trying to catch the intruder's face as soon as he turned. Then I noticed something on the ground, right in front of the opening. At first, I didn't register what it was. My brain went to trash, because that's what you usually find. Old clothes, cardboard, maybe a sleeping bag. As I hit it with the beam, the shape resolved into something else. An animal. It looked like a dog. We've had strays around that siding for as long as I've worked there. Skinny mutts that hang around for scraps, mostly skittish and harmless. A couple of the guys will toss them food when they've got leftovers. I actually recognized this one by its coat pattern. Not a big dog, maybe 20 pounds. It was dead, and it hadn't died by accident. That much was certain. Firstly, it had clearly been dragged there, judging by the marks that led me there. Secondly, the scene in front of me was gruesome. The body was torn up in a way that didn't match getting hit by a train. There was blood on the stones all around it. Parts of the animal were missing or pulled apart. It was clear that it had been mauled. That realization stopped me cold in the lane. I kept the flashlight on it for a few seconds. Then my eyes went straight back to the open boxcar door. The shuffling noise I'd been hearing was coming from inside that car. Something moved in the darkness, but I couldn't quite catch it with my beam as it was too close to the side wall. For a second, I thought a man was going to step out, somebody dirty and half feral. Then it came forward far enough for my beam to catch some of it, and the shape resolved into something that only looked human at first glance because it was upright. It had the height of a large man, but the whole body looked wrong, like it didn't quite fit together. The shoulders were broad but uneven, one higher than the other, and it carried them up around its neck like it was bracing. The chest looked heavy and misshapen, and the back line didn't run straight, more like a hump and a dip, as if the spine and muscles weren't built evenly. The head sat too far forward, with almost no normal-looking neck, giving it a top-heavy, hunched profile. When the light hit its face, it flinched hard, like the beam physically bothered it. It recoiled deeper into the boxcar for a half-second, then leaned forward again, still trying to stay in the dark while keeping me in sight. It had a muzzle. Not quite a dog's muzzle, not clean and familiar. It was thick and blunt, with a wide mouth and teeth that showed when it breathed. The eyes reflected bright in my flashlight and stayed locked on me. The fur coverage was uneven. Some sections were covered in thick fur, while other areas were almost bare, showing dirty skin. It reminded me of normal human body hair distribution: arms, shoulders, chest, lower abdomen, thighs, but exaggerated and irregular, like it had been turned up too far and applied unevenly. Its arms were long, and the hands were mostly human, with long fingers that ended in claw-like nails. These claws weren't particularly long or hooked, just sharp and too thick to fully pass as nails. As it stepped closer to the threshold, it raised one hand and held it up between its face and the light, like a person shielding their eyes. It wasn't panicked. It looked annoyed, disturbed by me being there. I took a couple of steps back without meaning to. I couldn't take my eyes off it. My flashlight stayed on it even though my hand was shaking like hell. It dropped out of the boxcar in one quick, ungraceful motion. It didn't climb down like a person. It just committed to it, swung its weight out, and landed hard in the ballast. The landing wasn't clean. One foot hit first, the other came down a beat late, and it rocked sideways like its body didn't balance evenly. It caught itself with a slight crouch and a quick plant of its hands on the stones, then pushed back up. The movement looked badly coordinated, like the strength was there, but the frame didn't line up right. Even standing still, it held itself crooked, shoulders uneven, head pushed forward, one hip slightly higher. It kept that clawed hand up near its face for another second, as if the light bothered it, then lowered it enough to stare at me again. The sound it made was low and rough, part growl and part breath, like air being forced through a throat that was leaking in several places. Its posture was forward and aggressive, weight on the front foot, shoulders hunched, head low. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. It was claiming the space between us. Then it did something that made the situation even clearer. It glanced down at the dead dog, grabbed it with one hand like it was nothing, and threw it back into the boxcar. The body hit the opposite wall with a dull slap. The move felt possessive, like I was too close to what it considered its personal space or territory. The creature immediately turned its attention back to me. It started forward, step by step, shoulders hunched, head low, no longer trying to shield its face from the light. Both arms were stretched off to the side now, hands uncurled and clawed fingers spread wide. Every second it got closer, it looked more certain, more hostile. The weird growling deepened. It wasn't warning me off so much as working itself up to something. I backed up as far as I could while keeping the beam on it, and then my brain finally made the decision my body was already trying to make. I turned and ran. The gravel rolled under my boots, and I almost went down more than once, but I managed to keep moving. I could hear it come after me, heavy impacts and scraping and those damn growls that never fully stopped. Every few seconds, I looked back over my shoulder. It was following, but the way it moved was just as wrong as the shape of its body. It could stand upright, but it couldn't run on two legs. Even on four, the gait was uneven, like it had trouble keeping its balance, or like one side didn't work as well as the other. It wasn't exactly fast, and it didn't close the distance the way a normal predator would have. I was able to stay ahead of it quite easily. The thing must have realized the same thing. It chased me down the lane for about 100 yards. Then the sounds shifted behind me, slower, receding. When I looked back again, it had stopped running and was turning away. It vanished back into the dark between the rows, heading the way it came, toward that open boxcar it had chosen as its home. I didn't stop running until I hit more light and open space, and even then, I kept looking back, waiting to see it again. I made it back to the office shack and into the break room area. By then, everyone else had gone back out to work. The place was empty except for the hum of the lights and the sound of the radios. I had to decide what to do, and fast. To be honest, in that moment, I only cared about myself. I wasn't thinking about doing the right thing or protecting the next guy who walked that lane. I was thinking about keeping my job and getting through the rest of the shift without going back out there. I did not want anything to do with that thing. I didn't want to be the person who reported it, tried to explain it, and then got dragged into questions, statements, and jokes for the next 6 months. So I stayed quiet. I told myself the train would be moving on within the hour, and if the thing was living in a boxcar, it would likely be gone with it. This wasn't local equipment. That train was headed towards St. Louis, and it was just passing through our siding. If the creature had ridden in on that consist, then the best-case scenario for me was that it would ride out the same way and never show up here again. I also knew how it would go if I tried to tell the truth. Nobody was going to believe I saw an upright, man-like creature with hands and a muzzle like a dog or a wolf. They'd say it was a man in a mask, or I'd had too much caffeine, or I got spooked by a stray dog. Even if I reported a trespasser, it would turn into a search with flashlights and a bunch of guys walking around between cars, and that felt like a good way to get someone hurt. I sat there for a couple of minutes, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I'm certain whatever it wasn't just an animal. It was too human in too many ways. Upright posture, hands that worked like hands, The way it reacted to the flashlight and sized me up. The way it guarded that boxcar like it was personal property. At the same time, it clearly wasn't a normal person. The face and body were wrong. The whole thing looked altered, like a human being that had been turned into what I saw. I have no idea why or how that kind of change could have happened to a grown person, or whether it was born that way. I don't have answers, and I'm not pretending I do. And there's another part. A normal person doesn't kill a stray dog and feed on it in the dark inside a boxcar. That dog wasn't just dead. It was torn up and handled like prey. The way the creature snatched it up and threw it back inside like it was protecting a meal told me exactly what I was dealing with. Now, people can think what they want about where something like that comes from. I'll say this. It wouldn't surprise me if the government has done things and put things out in the world that the public will never hear about. But I also know I'm never going to get the truth, and there's no point chasing it. This incident happened a few weeks ago. Nobody has seen that creature out here since, but I do want to put out a warning. That train was headed for St. Louis. If you live anywhere near a rail yard or a place where trains sit at night in that area, be careful after dark. Don't walk the tracks. Don't cut through rail property. If you hear shuffling or banging between cars, don't investigate. My name is Caleb, and I've been hunting whitetails with a bow in western Illinois for most of my adult life. Over the years, I've hunted a lot of the usual farmland stuff, fence lines, little woodlots, the corners of picked bean fields, but the Mississippi River floodplain was always something I treated with a little more caution. When most people think of Illinois deer hunting, they picture rolling corn ground and tidy woodlots you can see across. The stretch I like isn't like that. It's a rough piece of flood ground tucked between a levee and the main river. When the Mississippi comes up, the whole area changes. Low spots fill, old channels wake back up, and what looked like solid ground in August turns into mud and standing water by late October. There are backwater sloughs, half-rotten drift piles, and patches of willow and cottonwood, so thick a man can barely squeeze through. The deer like it because most people don't. The evening this happened, it was late October, archery season. I've had permission on that ground for a few years. The farmer doesn't care much about deer as long as you stay out of his way during planting and harvest, and he's happy for someone to take a few animals out of the bottom. I'd told him more than once that if anybody else asked, he could send them my way so we could coordinate stands, but not many guys want to mess with that part of the property. Too much mud, too many hidden holes. I shot a compound bow I've had for a while. Nothing fancy by today's standards, just a solid mid-range hunting rig set at 65 pounds. I shoot fixed-blade broadheads on standard arrows. They're not the latest gadget, but I know where they hit. I had a small hip quiver with 5 arrows in it. That's more than enough for a normal evening sit. If you're slinging more than that on deer with a bow, something else is wrong. The plan that evening wasn't to sit in a stand. I keep a couple of stands hung on the main travel lines when the water is low, but the river had been up earlier that month and changed things enough that I didn't fully trust last year's patterns. Instead, I decided to still hunt, move slowly and quietly along the edge of a particular slough, and watch a narrow strip of higher ground the deer use when they're moving between cover and the corn. It's not a method that works everywhere, but in noisy, broken ground where nobody else goes, you can sometimes ease into bow range if you're patient. By the time I reached the end of the slough and eased up onto that higher strip, the sun was low enough that the light had gone flat. The official sunset was only a few minutes away. Out in the open, you could still see well enough without a light, but under the scattered trees and brush, everything was starting to blend into one shade of gray and brown. That's the window when deer like to move. They seem to know exactly how much light your eyes and your skin really need. I picked an angle that would keep the wind in my favor and started still hunting along the strip parallel to the corn. I moved a few steps at a time, then stopped and scanned ahead, first with my eyes, then with my ears. The standing corn on my right was tall and dense enough that I couldn't see more than an arm's length into it. To my left, the slough reflected what was left of the sky in long, broken streaks between the trunks. Straight ahead was a mix of shin-high grass, low brush, and the occasional drift log. A couple of 100 yards in, I finally saw what I'd come for. A deer eased out of a thin clump of brush ahead of me and stood with its head down, quartering away at an angle. At first, all I could see was the motion more than the body, a slight sway of the back and the flick of an ear. I froze and let my eyes focus. After a few seconds, the outline sharpened. Medium-sized whitetail, not a giant, but a decent animal. It stood on that same strip of higher ground I was following, maybe 40 yards out, with the slough on one side and the corn within a short bound on the other. I didn't draw right away. At that distance, with the light going and the wind doing little eddies off the corn, I didn't like the angle. Instead, I eased a little lower, bent my knees, and started to shadow it, moving only when it moved, stopping when it stopped. It was headed generally toward a little dip in the ground, where an old washout cut across the strip. I knew from past seasons that if a deer used that dip, there was a chance it would turn just enough to give me a clean broadside at 30 yards or less. The last of the sun slid below the trees behind me as I crept along that strip, keeping the deer in sight. Legal shooting light was down to minutes. The western sky still held a pale band of color, and that faint glow was just enough to outline the deer's back and shoulders against the darker brush. My eyes were fully adjusted. I could see well enough to place a shot if the angle turned my way. It wasn't bright, but it wasn't dark enough yet to call it. I remember thinking that it was exactly the kind of quiet, marginal evening I like. No trucks on the levee, no other hunters in sight, no dogs barking from the farmyard, just the soft rustle of dry stalks in the corn to my right, and the occasional drip of water in the slough to my left. There was nothing in that moment to suggest that I was about to watch something else come out of that same cover and take the shot away from me in a way I still have trouble fully explaining. I was watching that deer and thinking about where I'd need it to stop when everything went sideways. 1 second, it was just standing there, ears twitching, doing that slow, cautious walk they do when they're not quite sure if they want to commit to the open. The next second, the brush on the far side of it just blew apart. I didn't see anything come in from a distance. There was no warning, no running start that I picked up on. It was just there. One violent burst out of the willow trash between the strip and the slough. The deer barely had time to throw its head up. Whatever hit it came in low and hard from the offside, like a linebacker taking out a receiver. There was a solid, wet impact, a kind of thick thump, and the deer went over sideways with its legs kicking. For a few heartbeats, I honestly didn't process what I was looking at. My brain tried to put it in familiar boxes, big feral dog, maybe a coyote pack piled together, but none of that fit. The thing that came out of that brush was too tall, for one. Even hunched over the deer, its back line was too high above the ground. There was too much length in the forearms, too much spread in the shoulders. It moved wrong for any four-legged animal I've ever seen. It didn't maul the deer the way you see dogs do. It hit, got a grip, and then there was this ugly, choking sound from the deer that cut off faster than it should have. The whole struggle lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then the deer was just lying there, head twisted at an angle that didn't look right, legs giving a couple more reflex kicks before going still. The thing stayed over it, shoulders rolling as it adjusted its position, like it was making sure the job was done. I remember the way the light hit it. There was still a pale smear of sunset in the western sky behind me, and that little bit of glow, plus what was reflecting off the slough, was enough to make a kind of backlight. I could see the outline clearer than the details. It was upright over the deer, but not standing straight up, more like a man working on something on the ground, knees bent, weight forward. The torso was too long and heavy. The arms hung past what I'd call normal, and its head was turned just enough that I could see the shape of the muzzle. It wasn't a regular dog head. It had a muzzle, yes, but it was shorter and heavier than any canine I've ever seen. The forehead was tall, with a kind of sloped, human-looking brow ridge, and the ears sat lower and more backward than they should have. I didn't see shining teeth in detail in that first moment, just the suggestion of a longer jaw and the way the mouth hung slightly open as it breathed. The whole thing looked like somebody had pulled the worst traits of a person and a big dog and forced them together. I must have shifted my weight or let my bow creak, because at some point during all that staring, I made a noise. It wasn't loud, but in that kind of quiet, it didn't need to be. The beast froze over the deer. Then it turned its head and looked straight in my direction. I couldn't see its eyes clearly at that distance, but I knew the exact moment it found me. It straightened, or at least came up higher, and that's when I realized just how big it really was. Even on that uneven ground, with one foot near the deer and one back, it stood a good head and shoulders taller than me at least. The distance between us was probably 35 yards, give or take, not far in bow terms. The strip of ground between the slough and the corn suddenly felt very narrow. To my right, the corn was a dark wall. To my left, the slough and the mud. Straight ahead, this thing, now turned my way, chest angled toward me. We just stared at each other for a second or two that felt a lot longer. I don't remember making a conscious decision to draw. My body just did it. Years of practice took over. I eased the bow up, set my feet as best I could without looking down, and pulled. I can still feel that draw in my shoulders when I think about it. How heavy the bow felt, how slow the string came back, how every little creak and fabric rub sounded too loud in my own ears. When the string hit my anchor point, the thing started moving. It didn't charge full tilt. It came forward in a kind of half-crouched, rolling walk that covered ground faster than I liked. Each step was quiet for something that size, more of a soft, heavy placement than a stomp. I picked the front of its chest, settled the top pin where I thought it needed to be in that dim light, and let the first arrow go. I missed. I know I did because I heard the arrow hit something behind it with a dry crack and then nothing. No reaction, no flinch. The thing didn't even pause. If it noticed that first shot at all, I couldn't tell. It just kept coming, closing the distance a few more yards. In that moment, whatever part of my brain was still keeping track of legal light and hunting ethics shut off. This wasn't about filling a tag anymore. I grabbed for another arrow without taking my eyes off it. My fingers found the shaft, pulled it free, and I knocked it by feel. The whole time it kept moving. The range was down into what I'd guess was 20 yards now, maybe a hair less, and I could see more of it than I wanted to. The chest wasn't broad and deep like a bear's. It was narrower, more like a thick-chested man, with muscles showing under matted, oily, rough-looking hair. The fur wasn't clean and even. It clumped in places, and there were bare patches where I could see dark skin underneath. It didn't have a tail. That's something I noticed in a distant, detached way, because my mind was still trying to force it into a box labeled animal I understand. There was no swinging tail to balance it, no flash of white or flick. It moved on two legs, using its arms like a person would, hands hanging with the claws slightly curled in. I drew again. The second draw felt even heavier than the first. My mouth was dry, and I could hear my own breathing louder than the soft sounds it made. It had closed enough now that I could make out more definition around the head and shoulders. Thick neck, heavy jawline, ears pricked forward like it was curious more than afraid. It was angled slightly, not straight on, and I remember thinking that if I didn't put this arrow somewhere useful, I might not get another chance. When I released that second shot, I didn't see the arrow in flight the way I sometimes do in good light. I heard it. There was a different kind of impact, a dull, meaty thunk, followed by a sudden, sharp reaction. The thing jerked sideways and let out a sound I don't have a good word for, part snarl, part shout, with a rough edge that made the hair on my arms stand up. The arrow hit low, in the area I'd call the lower torso or high hip on a person. Not where I'd want to hit a deer, but enough to hurt anything. It reached down with one hand, one of those long, wrong-looking hands, and grabbed at the shaft, then thought better of it, and let go. For a second, I thought it was going to finish the closing distance anyway, wounded or not. Instead, it broke off. It spun in a way that was almost too fast for its size, turned away from me, and dove into the corn. The stalks exploded as it went through, the sound like someone driving a pickup through dry brush. I caught a last glimpse of its back, and the fletching of my arrow sticking out at an angle before the plants swallowed it. The whole thing, From the ambush on the deer to that last glimpse of it disappearing, couldn't have taken more than a minute, maybe a little more. Long enough for 2 arrows, a handful of hasty decisions, and the kind of sight picture I still see when I close my eyes. I stood there for a second, with the bow still in my hand, heart hammering, listening to the corn settle and the echoes of that snarl die away, very aware that whatever I just shot was hurt, but not down, and that there was now nothing between it and me but a thin strip of floodplain and a whole lot of bad footing. I didn't hang around to see if it changed its mind. As soon as the corn stopped thrashing, and I was sure it wasn't about to come straight back out, I started backing up the way I'd come. I didn't turn and run. The footing down there is bad enough in daylight, and the last thing I wanted was to go down in the mud with my bow tangled up, and that thing somewhere between me and the levee. I just eased backward a few steps at a time, eyes on the corn and ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. After I'd put a little distance between myself and that patch of corn, I pulled the small LED pen light out of my pocket and kept the beam pointed low, just enough to pick out roots, holes, and driftwood, without shining myself up like a target. When I got back up on the crown of the levee and could see the truck as a dark shape at the end of the access road, I finally let my shoulders drop a little. I didn't stop to look back down into the floodplain. Whatever that thing was, I wasn't about to give it another chance to drag me off into the dark. I sat in the truck for a while with the doors locked and the engine off, just listening. Nothing followed me up. No movement on the levee, no strange shapes in the field. Eventually, I started it, turned the lights on, and drove out slowly, half expecting to see eyes in the ditch or something standing in the road. I never did. By the time I hit the blacktop, the whole thing already felt like something my mind had made up to explain a bad shadow. I never called the game warden. I didn't tell the farmer exactly what I'd seen. All I said was that there was something down in that bottom he probably didn't want his grandkids messing with after dark, and that I was going to stay away from the area for a while.